People often believe silence is powerful because of what is said within it. But the silence that truly changes everything is the one that arrives when you finally stop caring. When your emotions are no longer tied to someone who once occupied so much space in your mind, the entire dynamic begins to transform. For a long time, the avoidant may have felt secure knowing your attention remained fixed on them. Even when the relationship was difficult, your emotional investment provided a sense of stability. It wasn't necessarily a deliberate attempt to cause pain. Rather, your continued presence became a safety net that protected them from confronting their own fears and insecurities. The moment you stop feeding that pattern, everything shifts. You no longer chase, you no longer seek answers. You stop reacting to every sign, every silence, every mixed message. And in that moment, something unexpected happens inside the avoidant. What unsettles them is not simply the possibility of losing you. It is the loss of a familiar structure that once made their world feel predictable. Avoidants often seek distance, but many grow comfortable believing someone will remain emotionally available despite that distance. They depend on the idea that someone is still waiting, still hoping, still invested. When that certainty disappears, confusion begins to surface. Suddenly, the emotional arrangement they relied upon no longer functions. The reassurance that your care would always be there starts to fade. The confidence they once had in your endless patience begins to weaken. They may find themselves questioning things they never questioned before. Your attention acted like a mirror. Through it, they could see themselves reflected in someone else's emotional world. When that mirror is removed, they are left wondering who they are without it. This is often when a subtle shift takes place. The person who once seemed distant may suddenly become more present. The one who avoided closeness may begin reaching out. A message appears. A memory is mentioned. A conversation starts that feels meaningful on the surface. To you, it may seem like genuine change. But very often, what drives this behavior is not a newfound readiness for connection. It is an attempt to restore a sense of familiarity. The emotional balance has changed, and they feel it. They are no longer certain they occupy the same place in your mind. They no longer know whether they still have influence over your emotions. By reaching out, they test the connection. By observing your response, they measure whether they still matter. Sometimes they will appear detached while quietly seeking your attention. Other times they may bring up shared memories, hint at regrets, or suggest emotions they never fully expressed. These actions can create the impression that they are finally opening up. The reality is often more complicated. When you were emotionally invested, they maintained distance. Once you step back, they move closer. Not necessarily because they are prepared for intimacy, but because they feel the absence of the emotional security your attention once provided. Most of this happens beneath conscious awareness. They are not always intentionally trying to manipulate or mislead. Instead, they are reacting to a deeper fear, the fear of no longer having access to the validation that your care once supplied. The irony is that true security comes from openness and vulnerability. Yet many avoidants have learned to seek safety through control instead. Distance feels safer than exposure. Emotional imbalance feels safer than genuine intimacy. That is why this stage can be so confusing. You may wonder whether they have finally changed. You may hope they have gained the awareness they once lacked. But often, what you are witnessing is an instinctive effort to return to a dynamic that feels familiar to them. For years, the connection may have revolved around pursuit and retreat. One person moved closer while the other stepped away. One gave more while the other withheld. Once you stop participating in that pattern, the avoidant loses a sense of orientation. The silence they once used as protection suddenly feels very different when it is directed back at them. What once felt empowering now feels unsettling. As your energy changes, they begin noticing the absence. The emotional charge that once existed between you is no longer there. The certainty that you would always remain emotionally available starts to disappear. And that is when another layer of their response emerges. They may suddenly appear softer, more reflective, more vulnerable than you have ever seen them before. Their words may carry warmth that was previously absent. Their actions may suggest regret. They may speak about missing you or realizing things they failed to understand before. It can feel as though they have finally recognized your value. But beneath that apparent vulnerability often lies something deeper: fear. Many avoidants carry an emptiness they struggle to acknowledge. Even when they rejected love, they still benefited from knowing it existed. Your affection reassured them that they mattered. Your attention confirmed their significance. Your persistence protected them from confronting doubts about their own worth. When you withdraw that attention, those hidden fears begin to surface. Without your reflection, they are forced to face themselves. This is why vulnerability can suddenly appear when you have already begun moving on. It is not always a calculated act. More often, it is an emotional survival response. They sense the connection slipping away, they feel the validation fading, and instinctively, they reach back toward the source that once filled that void. You may hear them speak about missing you. You may hear them express realizations they never shared before. Their words may sound heartfelt and sincere. The difficult truth is that vulnerability and healing are not always the same thing. Sometimes, what looks like emotional growth is simply the fear of losing access to something that once made them feel safe. And unless genuine self-awareness and change accompany those feelings, the old pattern remains waiting beneath the surface, ready to repeat itself once the familiar balance has been restored. They may even confess feelings of fear, isolation, or uncertainty. Moments like these can feel deeply meaningful because they seem so different from the emotional distance that characterized much of the relationship. For the first time, it appears as though the walls have come down and genuine openness has taken their place. But this is where the pattern often reveals itself. The vulnerability may last only as long as the discomfort that created it. Once they sense that your heart has softened again, once they feel reassured that they still matter to you, the urgency behind their openness begins to fade. Slowly, and almost unnoticed, the familiar defenses return. This cycle is not necessarily driven by malice. More often, it is rooted in self-preservation. What appears to be a breakthrough is frequently an emotional reaction to the fear of losing significance in your life. Their sudden honesty is not always evidence of lasting transformation. Sometimes it is simply a response to the anxiety of feeling forgotten. That is why these moments can feel so painful. You spent months, perhaps years, hoping for understanding, waiting for emotional honesty, wishing they would meet you halfway. Yet just as you begin to release the attachment and find peace, they return with a version of themselves you thought you would never see. Naturally, this creates confusion. You start questioning everything. Was your distance what finally made them realize your value? Have they truly changed? Could this be the beginning of something different? Beneath the surface, however, a deeper struggle is taking place. Avoidants often live in tension between two competing fears. One fear pushes them toward connection because no one wants to feel abandoned or completely alone. The other pushes them away because true intimacy can feel overwhelming, exposing, and difficult to control. When your absence becomes real, the fear of losing the connection often becomes stronger than the fear of closeness. As a result, they move toward you. They share feelings they normally hide. They reveal thoughts they rarely express. They seem more emotionally available than before. But once the connection feels secure again, the balance shifts. The fear of intimacy resurfaces. The same closeness they sought suddenly begins to feel threatening. Their protective instincts return and they retreat back into familiar patterns. What looks like sudden vulnerability is often an unconscious attempt to regain emotional equilibrium. By reconnecting, they restore a sense of stability that was disrupted when you stepped away. In many cases, they are trying to answer an internal question. Do I still matter? Their warmth becomes a source of reassurance. Their emotional openness becomes a way of calming their own anxiety. This does not mean the feelings they express are fake. In that moment, the emotions can be completely genuine. The problem is that genuine emotion is not the same thing as genuine growth. Real growth requires self-awareness, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable patterns. Fear-driven vulnerability, on the other hand, often disappears once the immediate discomfort has passed. This is why their return is frequently less about rebuilding the relationship and more about preserving a sense of emotional significance. They want to know the connection still exists. They want to believe they still occupy an important place in your heart. The vulnerability they display can become the final and most persuasive form of influence because it feels authentic, emotional, and disarming. Without realizing it, you can find yourself pulled back into a dynamic you worked hard to escape. The deeper reality is that what draws them back is often not love alone. It is the discomfort of facing themselves without the validation your care once provided. When an avoidant realizes they are no longer at the center of your emotional attention, a profound sense of instability can emerge. Your silence, your boundaries, and your decision to stop participating in the old cycle challenge the structure they had quietly come to depend on. For a long time, they may have assumed your care would remain available, regardless of how distant they became. You would reach out first. You would try to understand. You would forgive. You would wait. When that pattern ends, they experience something unsettling. The emotional influence they once relied upon begins to disappear. And in response, another defense can emerge. Rather than directly confronting their own avoidance, they may subtly encourage feelings of guilt, doubt, or nostalgia. Not necessarily through obvious manipulation, but through carefully chosen words that reignite old emotions. They may say things like, "I didn't think you'd move on so fast," or "I thought what we shared meant more than this." Perhaps they explain, "I just needed time to figure things out." Statements like these often carry an emotional weight that encourages you to revisit the past and question your decisions. Suddenly you begin wondering whether you gave up too soon, whether you should have been more patient, whether you misunderstood their struggles. The focus quietly shifts. Instead of examining the choices that damaged the relationship, you find yourself carrying responsibility for the distance between you. This is often how the avoidant protects themselves from confronting painful emotions directly. Rather than fully acknowledging their role in the dynamic, the emotional burden is subtly redistributed. The result is that you remain psychologically connected, even if the relationship itself has ended. Guilt becomes the thread that keeps the bond alive. And because you are empathetic, because you naturally want to understand and care for others, those feelings can be incredibly effective. Ironically, the very compassion that once drew you toward them can become the reason it is difficult to let go. You may notice that these messages often arrive when you are finally finding peace. Not when you are hurting the most, but when you are beginning to heal. A memory suddenly appears. A message arrives recalling a special moment. An apology is wrapped inside an explanation. "I know I hurt you. I was scared. Do you remember when everything felt different between us?" These words are powerful because they awaken emotions you have worked hard to settle. They create the feeling that the story is unfinished. What matters most is understanding what may be happening beneath the surface. Often, the goal is not to create a healthier relationship. It is to restore a sense of emotional influence and reassurance. The avoidant struggles with being forgotten, yet often fears the very intimacy required to build lasting closeness. As a result, they move back and forth between distance and engagement, using nostalgia, regret, and emotional appeals to maintain a connection without fully committing to it. Before long, you may find yourself questioning the very progress you fought so hard to achieve. You start wondering whether stepping away was the right decision. You question your boundaries. You second-guess the peace you've worked to build. And that uncertainty serves a purpose. What they often seek is not necessarily a second chance at the relationship. What they seek is confirmation that they still occupy a meaningful place in your heart. If they can awaken guilt, doubt, or emotional conflict within you, they receive reassurance that they have not been forgotten. In many ways, this also protects them from their own discomfort. If you begin carrying some of the emotional burden, they no longer have to carry all of it themselves. If they can convince themselves that the distance between you was equally caused by both sides, they avoid confronting the full reality of their own withdrawal. Shared responsibility becomes easier to accept than personal accountability. This is how the cycle quietly sustains itself. The uncertainty they create acts like a protective layer. It shields them from painful self-reflection while allowing them to maintain the emotional distance that has always felt safe. What makes this dynamic so difficult to recognize is its subtlety. It rarely arrives through obvious manipulation. Instead, it appeals to the qualities that once made the connection meaningful: your empathy, your patience, your willingness to understand, your tendency to look beneath the surface and see the pain behind someone's behavior. They depend on those qualities because they know you are more likely to seek understanding than judgment, more likely to forgive than condemn, more likely to search for explanations than simply walk away. As a result, feelings of guilt and uncertainty become a pathway back into the emotional maze you worked so hard to leave behind. Not because they genuinely want to build something healthier, but because your complete detachment forces them to face a reality they find deeply uncomfortable. And when you finally reach that point, when your emotional well-being no longer depends on their attention, everything begins to change. The energy shifts. For a long time, they controlled the rhythm of the connection. They determined when closeness felt acceptable and when distance became necessary. The cycle of drawing near and pulling away became familiar territory. It allowed them to experience connection without fully surrendering to it. But when you stop participating, that familiar structure starts to collapse. You stop reacting to silence. You stop searching for hidden meanings. You stop measuring your worth through their responses. And as your focus returns to your own healing, the balance between you changes. The sense of control they once relied upon begins slipping away. This control was never necessarily about dominating another person. It was about maintaining emotional security. It came from believing they could create distance and still remain important, that they could withdraw and still be pursued, that affection would remain available even when they offered very little in return. When that certainty disappears, they are forced into unfamiliar territory. For the first time, they must confront vulnerability without the protection of the old dynamic. Your detachment feels different than rejection. To them, it can feel like exposure. Their usual strategies no longer produce the desired effect. Silence no longer captures your attention. Withdrawal no longer triggers pursuit. Emotional distance no longer guarantees influence. The realization can be deeply unsettling because it challenges the entire system they built to protect themselves from emotional pain. At its core, avoidance is often rooted in a fear of losing control over emotions that feel overwhelming. Distance becomes a way of managing that fear. By staying one step removed, they believe they can experience connection without risking complete emotional dependence. But your detachment reveals something important. Their control only existed as long as you continued participating in the pattern. The moment you stop, the illusion begins to fade. And this is often where another familiar behavior appears. You may notice inconsistent signals: warmth followed by coldness, attention followed by silence, moments of closeness interrupted by sudden distance. These contradictions are rarely random. They serve as tests. They are attempts to determine whether they still affect you emotionally, whether they can still create uncertainty, whether your peace is truly secure or if it can still be disrupted. As long as uncertainty remains, they feel less powerless. This stage is rarely about creating genuine intimacy. It is about restoring a dynamic that once provided emotional comfort. Ironically, healthy balance can feel uncomfortable to someone who has spent years navigating relationships through distance and inconsistency. Stability feels unfamiliar. Predictability feels vulnerable. Emotional equality can feel threatening because it removes the protective barriers they depend upon. That is why they may begin mirroring your behavior. They may appear indifferent. They may act unaffected. They may even suggest that you are the one who has changed. Sometimes they imply that you have become cold, distant, or uncaring, but these reactions often reveal more about their discomfort than yours. If they can make you feel guilty for choosing peace, they create an opportunity to pull you back into emotional confusion. And confusion is familiar territory. Once you begin doubting yourself, the old pattern has a chance to return. The deeper truth, however, is not that they crave power over you. The deeper truth is that they fear the vulnerability beneath the loss of that power. Their need for control has always been a defense against a more frightening possibility, needing someone deeply and risking the pain of losing them. When you detach, you remove that defense. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through your refusal to keep participating in the cycle. Suddenly, they are left standing without the emotional shield they once depended upon. And because that experience feels so uncomfortable, they often return to what has always felt familiar, creating uncertainty. A kind message followed by distance. Unexpected affection followed by withdrawal. A moment of closeness followed by silence. The pattern repeats because the goal is not necessarily connection. The goal is to determine whether they still hold influence over your emotions. Meanwhile, something important is happening inside them as well. Your detachment forces them to face a reflection they have spent years avoiding. A reflection that asks who they are without someone else's devotion reinforcing their sense of importance. The identity built around staying emotionally protected begins to weaken. The image of being desired without fully opening up starts to crack. And rather than confront that collapse directly, they attempt to recreate the environment that once protected them. That is the heart of the pattern. Not a pursuit of deeper love, not a pursuit of lasting intimacy, but an attempt to return to the imbalance that once felt safe. Because what they ultimately struggle to release is not the relationship itself. It is the sense of control they use to shield themselves from vulnerability all along. The intimacy they feared may have been the very thing they needed. Many avoidants build their identity around self-protection and emotional control. Vulnerability feels dangerous, while distance feels safe. When you entered their life, you challenged that belief. Part of them wanted your warmth, your loyalty, and your connection. Another part feared it. Your love awakened desires they had buried long ago, the desire to trust, belong, and feel truly understood. Yet the deeper the connection became, the more exposed they felt. Your presence illuminated wounds they preferred not to acknowledge. Instead of moving closer, they often pulled away because facing those emotions felt overwhelming. Then you stop caring. The person who once provided comfort, validation, and certainty is no longer there. And without that distraction, they are left facing themselves. At first, they may try to fill the void with work, routines, distractions, or even new relationships. But external solutions rarely fix internal struggles. Because what they lost was not only a relationship, they lost a way of avoiding themselves. Without your attention reflecting value back to them, they may feel restless, disconnected, or empty. The strategies that once protected them no longer provide relief. The distance that once felt empowering begins to reveal a loneliness they cannot ignore. This is often when they return. They reach out, they reappear. They offer signs of regret, reflection, or change. Sometimes it appears genuine. Sometimes it sounds like growth. But often what drives these actions is not readiness for intimacy. It is the desire to regain what your presence once provided. They want to feel seen again. They want reassurance that they still matter. They want confirmation that they still exist in your emotional world. This is one of the hidden tragedies of avoidant behavior. They run from closeness because it feels threatening, yet suffer when that distance becomes real. They spend years caught between longing for connection and fearing it at the same time. When you finally detach, you interrupt that cycle. You stop being the emotional anchor they depended on. You stop providing the reassurance that protected them from self-reflection. And in doing so, you force them to confront something they can no longer avoid: themselves. Your silence becomes a lesson, not because it punishes them, but because it exposes the consequences of living behind emotional walls. The guilt, mixed signals, sudden vulnerability, and attempts to reconnect are often driven by fear rather than cruelty. Fear of being truly seen, fear of being truly known, fear of facing what lies beneath their defenses. That is why your detachment is so powerful. It removes the distractions, it exposes the pattern, and it reveals a truth that can no longer be ignored. The greatest distance was never between you and them. It was the distance between who they appeared to be and the parts of themselves they never learned to face. Until that gap is healed, no relationship can solve what they continue to avoid within themselves.